I feel like I have difficulty living up to that introduction now, so thanks for that, Louis. So what I'm talking about here is of course, Rosa Luxemburg's pamphlet, Reform or Revolution, which, as we said, we've just brought out a new edition. And this is, I think, a particularly timely point at which to be thinking about how do we as revolutionaries work in reformist parties, what's the point of fighting for reforms and so on. And how does that work, that intersection between reform or revolution? So a little bit about the pamphlet. So it's one of the earliest of Rosa Luxemburg works. And it was written at a time when she'd just gone to Germany. She went to Germany in 1898, specifically because it was one of the major centres of socialism, was referred to as social democracy then. So she deliberately sought that out. She was learning and teaching in Switzerland, and she deliberately went to Germany because she wanted to be absolutely at the centre of the struggle. And at that time, the German Social Democratic Party was sort of the major force, really, of socialism in Europe. It had hundreds of thousands of members. It got millions of votes in Reichstag elections, and it had built up a kind of a culture that members of the SPD could basically live and die in the party. So it wasn't just something that just happened when you were doing elections. You had kind of clubs for all sorts of entertainment. You had SPD choirs, you had SPD cycling clubs, you had SPD burial clubs. So you could indeed be buried in the party, where people would save up to pay for activists' funerals and so on. So it was kind of it must have felt really that they were creating a kind of a separate socialist society within German bourgeois society. So it was incredibly important part of the struggle. So that's why Rosa Luxemburg went to Germany to be part of that. But when she arrived in Germany, they were in the middle of the revisionist debate. So this was a huge debate that was convulsing the party. So Rosa Luxemburg immediately plunged into this and wrote a series of articles which then were turned into the pamphlet Reform or Revolution. And this was not terribly well received by a lot of the grandees in the party. You can see there was a debate at the party conference in Stuttgart where they were kind of supposed to settle the revisionist debate, and there's quite a lot of people make sort of snarky remarks about this young woman coming and telling all of these older men what they should think and where to get off and so on. And obviously some of them took it reasonably well, and some of them notably did not take it very well. So and this was kind of setting the tone really for Rosa's relationship with a lot of these figures that would be the case throughout the rest of her life. In fact, that could be consistently that the older male grandees of the SPD were just really pissed off with Rosa Luxemburg. So that's all that's great, and actually you should read some of the Stuttgart debates, because there's all sorts of entertaining comments. But so the revisionist debate was started by a member of the party, one of the leaders of the party, a guy called Edward Bernstein. So he argued that basically you didn't have to have a revolution anymore. So he was saying, well, actually, we don't need to be a revolutionary party. We don't need to be fighting for revolution. We can actually get reforms bit by bit within the current system. So that's what we should do. We can focus on winning elections, getting into positions of power, getting little bits of change, and actually that will build up to creating a socialist society bit by bit through getting reforms. So Rosa Luxemburg against this was arguing that actually no, you need to have both. So she says between social reforms and revolution there exists for social democracy an indissoluble tie. So in Reform or Revolution, this is very clearly the best expressed of all of the arguments against Bernstein in the revisionist debate, but it's not at all the only one. So there's loads and loads of figures in the SPD who weighed into this debate, mostly on the revolutionary side. So it sort of felt that actually this was batted away. So this party conference at Stuttgart, the party agreed, no, we are still a revolutionary party. We are absolutely still committed to building the revolution. So it kind of feels like, okay, job done. Unfortunately not. So what was happening in the SPD is that they have this formal commitment to revolution, which they reaffirm, but actually they are rapidly becoming a purely reformist party that actually doesn't really believe in fighting for revolution. And in fact, that was one of the objections to Bernstein that one of his friends in the party wrote to him and said, "My dear Ede, one does not say such things, one merely does them." So the problem was that he actually said openly what really they were doing. So, and this was something that Rosa Luxemburg said with hindsight in 1918. She said that the problem was that the party had the revolution located merely as a guiding star in the distance, as the final goal, rather than something that they actually believed in building towards in any meaningful way. It's been said, in fact, that on the eve of the First World War in 1914, SPD bureaucrats hung on to Marxist doctrine as if it was Sunday china, on proud display only because it was never used, which I think is a great expression, actually. And of course, the First World War in 1914 is this major betrayal of revolutionary principles, where the SPD, along with other parties elsewhere in Europe, immediately ditched all of its commitment to international solidarity and to anti-war work and so on, and supported the German government in its drive to war in the First World War. And that in fact, you know, in a way, when we talk about it, sometimes people talk about it as if this was this massive shock, and I think there was a great feeling of shock and betrayal that the SPD had done this. But actually, it's completely predictable. When you look at some of the reformist lines that they were coming out with in the years and decades before that, actually it was very much consistent with what they had been saying. So, as August Bebel, who's one of the sort of the grandees of the party, said as early as 1900, where he was talking about the possibility of war in Russia, and he said in the Reichstag that if it came to war with Russia, I would be ready, old boy that I am, to shoulder a gun against her. So they were never very, they were never very convincingly actually revolutionary in their attitudes to capitalist war. So that kind of swinging behind the war in the First World War was not actually particularly surprising. And of course, the SPD is still around and is still a reformist party that has now abandoned its commitment to revolution. So, okay, so Reform or Revolution, it's a pamphlet that's written for a debate that was formally won but actually lost. So why should we be paying any attention to it today? Why is it relevant? And it's interesting because, it's like I said, the SPD is still around, and it's basically it's a party rather like the Labour Party in this country that is effectively a reformist party that doesn't even offer reforms anymore. So they have the kind of the whole sort of compromising with capitalism bit, and they don't have the even small improvements in working people's lifestyles to kind of to pay us off with. So you might think that actually this is an old debate. Why are we still paying attention to it? But this debate about how does the revolutionary goal relate to fighting for reforms in the present is still really live on the left. So it is still worth thinking about. So the first major question that's really that's implicit, if you like, in the reformist debate, the revisionist debate, is can you change capitalism bit by bit, or do you have to have a revolution? So the reformist position is that you can build up a change to capitalism through small changes. That every small reform that you win, every trade union right, or some law regulating working conditions, or better benefits, or whatever it is, kind of changes capitalism a little bit towards a socialist society. So if you just build up enough of those, you can transform the whole society to socialism. So this was something that Clara Zetkin, who was speaking on the revolutionary side at Stuttgart, characterized. She said that the reformist argument was that we get a little bit of a future socialist state here and another little bit there, and we need only, as it were, stitch the whole thing together. Which I think you can kind of tell what she thinks of this argument, but I thought that was quite well expressed. So of course, Rosa Luxemburg, like Clara Zetkin, was very scornful of this idea, and she was absolutely right to be so. I mean, this is basically trying to use the mechanisms and the organs of the capitalist state to destroy the capitalist state, and this is not something that you can do. So Rosa Luxemburg at Stuttgart said, "There's no cure for capitalist anarchy in the herb garden of capitalist society," and she was absolutely right. And she kind of makes fun of this argument in Reform or Revolution in a fantastic quotation where she says that the revisionists are trying to dilute the sea of capitalist bitterness into a sea of socialist sweetness by progressively pouring into it bottles of social reformist lemonade. Now, I never realised that this isn't just a kind of a flight of fancy on her part. This is a reference to a guy called Charles Fourier, who was a utopian socialist, who actually did think that one of the advances that you would have when you had the world was one socialist state would be that you could transform the seas so that they would be sweet like lemonade, so that you could drink the seas, and that the people would sail on them, pulled along by aquatic creatures, which would have wiped out the ghastly legions of sea monsters. So you can see how scientifically credible this is. But it's actually kind of quite important, because he's a utopian socialist. And actually, utopian socialism is one of the areas where you still have actually really quite influential this argument that you can change capitalism bit by bit. I mean, this is particularly prevalent in parts of the Green movement. But every time you talk to somebody, you're saying, oh, well, you can't have a revolution. But what you need to do is just withdraw from taking part in, capitalist society by having just sort of co-ops where you just exchange things rather than buying things. And anyone who's sort of positing that you can kind of, as an individual or as a small community, kind of withdraw from the capitalist system, and that if everyone did that, then the whole thing would just collapse. That's a very utopian socialist position, but that's also the position of people like Bernstein in the revisionist debate, that we can just change capitalism bit by bit, and then it will either fall apart or we will be able to sort of overthrow it without having to have a revolution. So it's quite important, actually, that it's Fourier that Rosa Luxemburg is talking about there. Okay, so we're convinced that actually we do need a revolution to fundamentally change society. But the other side of the argument that Bernstein would put is that, well, you have to settle for changing capitalism bit by bit because you can't have a revolution. So Bernstein was saying that, well, we used to think that capitalism would just inevitably collapse, but it's actually proved much more durable than we thought, so therefore we have to settle. We have to find another way because there's no option. And this is something that actually quite a lot of more modern scholars kind of pick up on. And there's also, if you Google kind of, sort of academic papers on Rosa Luxemburg, I mean, obviously there's whole university departments doing sort of academic studies on Rosa Luxemburg. But an awful lot of this actually kind of comes to that same conclusion, that, well, it would be nice if she was right, but obviously capitalism is never going to collapse. There's nothing wrong with capitalism, and therefore you can't have a revolution. And this is a fundamental mischaracterization of Rosa Luxemburg's argument, because she never said that it was inevitable that capitalism would collapse. What she said was that it was inevitable that capitalism would have crises, that then an option in those crises is that we could have a revolution and we could transform society to a socialist society. And of course, remember that what she said was that the choice was between socialism or barbarism. And I think when you look at the history of the 20th and the 21st century, well, we got the barbarism. I mean, I think people sometimes, particularly these academic arguments, sometimes talk as if, well, she was wrong that actually capitalism was unstable and that you would have crises. But then I think they are not looking at their history. She was absolutely right in what we were facing. It was just that we weren't able to actually have the socialist revolution that would have rescued us from the barbarism of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that idea that capitalism is just too strong is not one that we need to entertain. And it's interesting actually when you look at some of what the reformists in the SPD were saying, how much it's not really that they want there to be a revolution but they've despaired of it being possible. It's actually that they've got to the point where they really disapprove of the idea of revolution. And it comes with actually a fundamental distrust really of working class power. That they've got to the point where they don't want to see people on the streets. They think this is a bad thing. And this has actually been happening in the SPD for quite a long time. So there's a row that the people in the SPD have with Marx and Engels, in fact, in the 1870s. And Marx and Engels write an open letter to the SPD leadership, rebuking them for the positions that they've been taking precisely on this. And I'll read you the quotation because I think it's funny. So they're characterizing it's a particular guy called Hofburg, but he'd been expressing what quite a lot of the leaders of the SPD had been saying. So Marx and Engels write back to them and say, their position means that if Berlin should be again so uneducated as to have another 18th of March, that's the 1848 revolution, the Social Democrats, instead of taking part in the struggle as rabble with a mania for barricades, must rather pursue the path of legality, curb the movement, clear away the barricades, and if necessary, march with the splendid army against the rough, one-sided, uneducated masses. If the gentlemen maintain that this is not what they meant, then what did they mean? So I think that shows you kind of the attitude that the SPD were taking to the idea of revolution, that actually they've got to the point where they don't think that this is a good thing, and actually they're scared of proletarian revolution. That people like Bernstein were arguing that basically what you have to have is you have to civilize the working classes so that they become more acceptable to the bourgeoisie, and then the bourgeoisie will be nice to them and give them rights and let them have the vote and let them be well treated and so on. But it's like we have to deserve the benevolence of the bourgeoisie, is their position. And this is actually, I think, in sort of liberal opinion, this is actually still quite common, that people do implicitly, if not explicitly, think that, well, if we just behave nicely, then we will be treated properly by our rulers, and the system will be fair and treat us all legally, and so on and so on and so on. And I think, and those of you who've heard, I've done a few talks in Counterfire branches recently about Epstein and Andrew and Mandelson. And one of the conclusions that I think you can draw from the Epstein files is that you cannot trust the ruling class to treat anyone fairly, because they are all absolute arseholes, and they are all personally absolutely corrupt. And this idea that we can just behave well enough to deserve favours from the bourgeoisie is just never going to work. So I think we can see that this is an argument of people who actually themselves want to be able to join the bourgeoisie and are actually rather afraid of the forces that have put them in their position where they can aspire to that, but that actually might challenge them. And that is a kind of a thread that runs through the revisionist debate, and I think is still very true of politicians in reformist parties now. So the point that Rosa Luxemburg makes about the relationship of reform and revolution is that they're not two separate tactics that you can pick to get to the same goal. So she says it's not like choosing between hot or cold sausage at the counter. So reforms are absolutely essential, because you need to have the victories in the here and now. You can't be telling people that, well, it doesn't matter, what you're suffering today, your victimization that you're suffering at work, or you haven't got a job, or whatever, or your benefits have been cut, or whatever it is. You can't tell people, okay, that stuff doesn't matter because it'll all be sorted out after the revolution. So Rosa Luxemburg says at another Congress at Stuttgart in 1907, that for us the dialectics of history do not mean standing with folded arms until ripe fruit falls into our hands. And I think that's a really nice way of putting it. It's that kind of, what she's talking about there is that behaviour where you don't take part in the movement, you just stand on the side and sell it papers. We're not going to stand aside from the day-to-day struggles or the immediate struggles, because winning those reforms is important for itself, that if you can improve people's lives in the short term, then you've got to try and do that. But also because it's building the movement, and having those interim victories is how you will build the revolutionary party and be in a position where you have an opportunity to actually create the revolution, that you'll be able to do that. So that is, she says, incredibly important. Whereas what the reformists had slipped into was seeing that goal of the revolution as being just incredibly abstract. So Bernstein said that he has extraordinarily little feeling for or interest in what is usually termed the final goal of socialism. So he thought that, well, you don't have to think about where you're going in that long term. You just think about the immediate reforms. And Rosa Luxemburg's point is that by doing that, though, it's not that you're picking that one tactic rather than the other at the sausage counter, as she says. You're actually you're heading for a different goal. So she says it's not that it's a more tranquil, calmer and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. So in other words, if you're not fighting for reforms because ultimately you want to overthrow the whole system, you can't actually even fight effectively for reforms, because what you're doing, if you're saying, well, we're not going to overthrow the whole system, but we just want to be treated a bit better, what you're doing is fighting for things which will ultimately make working class people that little bit better off, and therefore that little bit less likely to challenge the bourgeoisie. So what you're doing is you're asking the bourgeoisie to give us a crumb, and then we will, that will pacify people, and we will be less of a challenge to you. So that's a fundamentally different goal than that we are fighting for reforms now because we are fighting for socialism in the future when we can get it. So this is what Rosa Luxemburg's point, that it's not that you can choose the polite way or you can choose the nasty working class rough in the streets way. Actually, the only way that you will get socialism is that you have to be part of the struggle for reforms, but with understanding that we're heading for revolution. And in fact, if you don't have that understanding, actually you can't fight effectively for reforms either. And this is, I think, where I'm going to end this introduction. So I'm sure people will have seen the proposal in your party to sling out all the socialists on the basis that we're not in accordance with what your party is trying to do. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of what an effective reformist party is. Because if you don't have that wider goal, you actually can't fight effectively for reforms, because what you are doing is you're fighting for that compromise with the bourgeoisie, and you're saying, well, actually, this is what the party will be for. So ultimately, you won't win reforms. This is how you end up being the Labour Party or the SPD in Germany, which is a reformist party that doesn't actually offer any reforms to ordinary people. The only way that you can be an effective challenge to win reforms in the here and now is actually with a meaningful understanding of that revolutionary goal. So revolutionaries are the best reformists, and we're not interlopers into the Reformist Party, or something that the Reformist Party has to get rid of because somehow we have this kind of, this murky goal which is somehow different from what the Reformist Party is trying to do. We are the ones who understand that actually the party's success is incredibly important, but that it doesn't stop there, and that if you try and stop it there, you don't win anything at all. What you win is a position where you have a world war declared, and the party that's supposed to be speaking for ordinary people who are about to be killed in their millions on the front says, oh yeah, that's great, we're all patriotic, we'll support this. You have a party that capitulates at every point where it has to actually stand up to the bourgeoisie. That's what you win if you don't have revolutionaries at the heart of your reformist movement. And that's why I think the lessons of the revisionist debate and Rosa Luxemburg's pamphlet is incredibly important for us today. Thank you.